Okay, so let's discuss Jonah Hill and this whole saga that I'm going to coin a new term for this. At least I'm assuming nobody else has called it this, SurferGate. I'm calling it SurferGate. So Jonah Hill's ex-girlfriend, who I guess is a surfer, female surfer, pretty cool career path, by the way. I don't know any professional surfers, and I'm sure female surfers, professional surfers, are an even smaller community. But what do I know about the surfing community, quite frankly? His ex-girlfriend has been releasing their private text messages where she's claiming look, he's emotionally abusive, he's a gaslighter, he's using therapy speak to emotionally manipulate me. I find this fascinating. I find this whole thing fascinating. Basically, the screenshots do show that he wanted to control her. He wanted to control her image. And he's like, basically, yeah, I know you're a surfer, but do you have to be in a bikini when you're surfing? Do you have to be attracting the male gaze on your Instagram? Do you have to have these pictures where you look like you're flirting with your male friends and blah, blah, blah. So you see definitely a pattern of very controlling and micromanaging her image, how she presents herself. And it's interesting how somebody who does that, right? It's after a while, you can only blame something on jealousy or insecurity even within the relationship for so long. And eventually just becomes clear that this is just control tactics, right? And that he's probably, maybe I'm playing armchair, diagnosis here, but as a guy who was overweight for so long, and he's talked about that it's been a lifelong struggle, and that he doesn't like when it comes up in interviews when they ask him about his weight loss and stuff like that. It seems clear to me that he's projecting his own insecurities of image onto this woman, right? But there's a few different elements that I find really interesting about this. First off, seeing the screenshots, I immediately was like, why would anybody want to date this guy? Why would you want to have a relationship with a guy who's... It's one thing to be like, hey, I have to tell you, I feel weird about this and I feel silly asking you, but I don't feel comfortable with you being in a bikini so much on social media. And, there's a way to communicate that where I would think, okay, he's really struggling with this and he wants to talk to his girlfriend about it and figure out what can they do? Can they do something to work this out together? But it's very controlling, and to me it seemed very inherently patronizing. His communication style, if you've seen the screenshots, you know what I'm talking about. It feels very controlling in a way that seems really toxic, that I'm like, why would you even want a relationship with somebody like that? And I'm aware that abuse, especially emotional abuse, is typically incremental, right? It becomes more and more intense. So for her to, and you see her responding in some of the screenshots where she's like, okay, I took some of them down. So it's just so interesting to me, the human psychology of this taking a while for people to pick up on, that they would even agree to these terms that this guy in this case is setting, these parameters, and he frames it as his boundaries, which is really interesting terminology, right? Because boundaries are about you and what makes you feel comfortable, but here he's projecting onto her these specific requests, which are not actually boundaries. To be more specific, he says to her in the screenshots, in the text, these are my boundaries for a relationship. I don't want to date a girl who has bikini shots all over her Instagram and a shot of her in a thong while she's surfing. And she responds it's not a thong. But yet you can tell that he found his prey. He found the right victim to this kind of control style, because she still acquiesced. And it's so interesting to me to see that exchange, that she goes, it's not a thong, but okay. And I feel that's something I would do. Your instincts would notice this is not okay, so you react kind of passive aggressively as she has. And it's a very passive aggressive exchange between the two of them. But she still agrees to take down these shots, these pictures of her that make him uncomfortable. So she's She wants him to feel comfortable. She's acquiescing, right? But in her tone, you can tell that it doesn't feel right to her. But again, him calling this boundaries is really interesting. So this has made me think of I have a few takeaways from this whole thing. The first takeaway is, I think it's interesting how we always assume that abuse is going to look a certain way. It's going to be very black and white, very clear. And what we're seeing is how in this era of people being more and more cerebral and more crafty and more well-spoken and more emotionally intelligent, we're seeing that things like emotional abuse are becoming more and more nuanced and more complex. This guy knew what he was doing in the way that he's communicating with her, that he's using therapy speak to kind of get in her head of, well, our therapist, we went to counseling, our therapist said this, that I need to really prioritize my boundaries with women. And so it's not just the obvious sort of abuse of emotional abuse of, F you, you're a terrible partner to me, like all this stuff that's typical of like the putting down. This is like very passive aggressive, beat around the bush, emotional control and manipulation and all that stuff. So that was my first takeaway, how we're in this era now where emotional warfare, right? Psychological warfare is much more complex than ever, as I think our society, as people are becoming more and more cerebral and educated. And by the way, I think that applies to everything. Like, to me, COVID is our World War III. Like, even traditional warfare, right, is so much more subtle now. It's chemicals, it's diseases, and I think the pandemic is a great example of that. Obviously, that's like a whole other point, but I'm trying to say literally warfare, both physical warfare and mental warfare, is so much more. We live in a new world where abuse isn't just hitting your partner anymore, and war, real war, isn't just guns, right? Everything now is so much more subtle, so much more in here. So that's my first takeaway. My second takeaway is that whenever things like this happen, people are very quick to take sides, right? For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. So if you post your ex's screenshots, some people are going to sympathize with you, and some people are going to be like, girl, what the F are you doing? Why are you publicly shaming this guy? I love his movie Superbad. I'm a huge fan of him. Why, you're always going to then have people who start victim blaming. And the reality is it takes two to tango, so she definitely fell for it, right? I mean, when I read the screenshots, my first instinct was like, girl, come on, this is so obvious. This guy's a dud. Why are you with him? But as somebody who years ago, and I made a video about this, some of you will remember, those of you who have been subscribed for years, I made a video about a guy I briefly dated about 3 years ago. And when I say briefly, it was met him on an app. He was visiting from out of town. So when I realized he was out of town and already in transit by the time we were texting, I was like, I had no interest, but he kept pursuing me, and it was a virtual relationship for like 2 months. He would call me consistently. We would text almost every day. And so he kind of got in my head emotionally by that point. And at the 2-month or so mark, he was like, come visit me, come visit me. I went to visit him in Atlanta at the time. This was about 3 years ago. And it was one of the worst weekends, if not the worst weekend of my life, because he was just putting me down in his own ways the whole weekend. And it was very subtle in the beginning, and then it progressively got more and more like a dark cloud was over me, to the point where by the end of the weekend, I couldn't wait to come home. And I felt very insecure after that whole thing happened, and I was like, what did I do wrong, blah, blah, blah. But either way, my instincts were like, this doesn't feel good. Go home, and you don't need to talk to this guy ever again. Even if he made you question all these things and made you kind of pulled out some insecurities, this clearly doesn't feel right. And it took me time to process, and I've talked about this on this channel. I made a few videos about this story, actually. That he was it took me some time. It took me a few days to really digest what had happened that weekend with him, because it was so different from the communication of the previous 2 months, right? So it took me some time to realize, like, oh, this guy's a textbook narcissist. And just like this Jonah Hill story, it took me time to really digest it because it was incremental. And when I looked at it from the bird's eye view, farther away, leaving Atlanta after that weekend, it became so obvious to me. But in the moment, it was not obvious. So that made my second reaction, reading this ex-girlfriend's screenshots, it made me go straight from that initial feeling of like, girl, come on, to, but I've been there, and you don't understand that experience unless you've been there, right? This is one of those things where you become more empathetic when you've been there. And I think if you haven't been there, it's so easy to judge and to think like, why did you even engage with a guy who's sending you these screenshots? But what you don't realize is that for every one of those shitty text messages, he probably also love bombed her with 5 more messages in real life and via text, right? He probably supplied her with all the love languages in the world. But then here and there, he would send these very controlling, degrading texts that have an inherent sort of misogyny in them, in that he's trying to control her image as a woman when this is literally a part of her career, right? Like, she would get paid apparently to do some modeling stuff. She's a surfer, so she's naturally going to be, not in conservative clothing when she's surfing. She's going to be in athletic, like summer wear, beach wear, whatever you want to call it. The other angle that I find so interesting about this is these men who are attracted to women who they meet being famous for this stuff. Like, this was her career. He met her knowing that this was part of her thing, part of her brand. This is what she does, that she goes out and surfs, so she's often in bikinis. Even if he didn't meet her that way, he knows that this is her career and that she makes presumably a living partially from social media. So it's so interesting to me how these men will be attracted, and it probably goes both ways, by the way. There's probably women who are attracted to men who they meet knowing this is part of who they are, this is part of their identity. This reminds me of Marilyn Monroe. When she was married to Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player, he met Marilyn Monroe knowing she was Marilyn Monroe. It's not like he met her before the fame. He met her as the actress, the sex symbol, all of that. So he was attracted to that. But then they get married, and suddenly it's like, well, you better keep this for me. You're kind of my object now. I don't want you doing this stuff. He allegedly was very upset. They say he like hit her, beat her up after she did that iconic scene, probably that she's most famous for, other than the birthday speech to JFK at the time. The scene in the movie where she's on the air vents in the city, right, and the air comes up and the dress comes up, that white dress, that iconic scene, right? He was there when she was filming that, and apparently he was very upset about it. So I find that very interesting. Again, these people who are attracted to that sexuality, that femininity, but then they want to control it, right? Kind of like not on my watch kind of thing. And it's so hypocritical, and I do think that's like inherent misogyny, right? When you are attracted to that, but as long as you get to control it and it's only for you. Not to mention, if this is how women like this make money, right? If this is part of their career, that's a whole other level of, I think, disrespect. Because now you're saying that you want to potentially affect this person's income because of your complexes with control and power and all that. So there's different layers to this. The final thing I want to say about this, and this is a jaw dropper, what I'm about to say. I met somebody a long time ago who told me that Jonah Hill was on the down low, and that Jonah Hill had flirted extensively with gay guys he had known or something like that. I just remember vaguely, I don't remember the exact details, but I remember that it was a thing that people in Hollywood knew, or people around that circle, or gay men around that scene of Hollywood, blah, 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 know that Jonah Hill goes for guys on the low. Obviously, I have no facts to prove this, but I find this very interesting because This is a theme I find that a lot of the guys I meet on the down low, right? As a gay person, I'm constantly exposed to men who are married, men who have girlfriends who will hit on me and send suggestive signals. I feel like to be able to do that, you have to inherently be misogynistic. Like to have that image of, and more than misogynistic, I think a lot of gay men who are closeted have a hatred for women because women represent a nuisance to them. It's like, I don't even want you, I'm just doing this for show kind of thing, right? And when I think about guys I've met who do stuff behind their wives' backs or their girlfriends' backs, there's an inherent disregard for the female partner there, right? So this story, that was one of the first things I thought of when I heard this story with Jonah Hill and this ex-girlfriend. I'm like, he probably doesn't even like her. Like, as a person, he's probably not even fully attracted to women or has a complicated attraction to women because of this story I heard years ago that he also has a thing for guys. If you're closeted, you must have such a complicated relationship in general, right? With sexuality, with both genders, that it doesn't faze me at all to think that he would be emotionally manipulative to women in relationships because potentially he's not actually fully attracted to them. This also strangely makes me think of Joe Jackson of the Jackson 5, the Jackson family, that it's well documented that he was much kinder and more sympathetic to his kids and his female partner from his affair. He was much nicer to those kids, and he let those kids call him dad, whereas Joe Jackson famously only let the Jackson kids call him Joe by his first name. So again, that makes me think, like, is this a thing that people will emotionally manipulate and be abusive towards certain partners in their lives, but not others who they actually maybe much prefer, but for whatever reasons, family reasons, cultural reasons, they stick with a certain partner to maintain an image and to sort of keep things as they are, but they have like a resentment towards that partner who they don't actually want to be with. So whenever I hear of men being emotionally manipulative towards women, not necessarily physically abusive, but emotionally abusive towards women, I always wonder if deep down they're gay and they're so angry, like they're so resentful that they have to be or feel a need to be in a relationship with a woman that they kind of act out emotionally in that relationship so that they can kind of do their thing on the side. Obviously, that's a huge theory, and I'm sure not every guy who's emotionally, manipulative or disrespectful to his female partner doesn't necessarily mean they're on the down low, but I always go straight to that assumption because of cases that I've seen. Curious, as always, what you guys think. Tell me in the comments.